Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last in a series of three sessions on tree nursery growing practices. We're here again with Dan Ziomek. Sorry, Dan, not Don, Dan. Dan Ziomek. And he will be talking this evening about maintenance schedule for our tree nursery as well as other topics. So let's just turn it over to Dan and get underway.
All right, sounds good, Mary. So first, this wasn't on camera, but we met at the nursery last time and talked about pruning and staking and that kind of thing. Just want to check and see if anybody came up with any questions from that little outing that we had.
You mentioned a source for getting tall bamboo. I was talking about how expensive the shipping is. Can you say again where that might be? So
Griffin Greenhouse Supply out of Tewksbury, Mass. Would be able to supply tall bamboo, and we could tack them on to an order of ours. We're talking about ordering benches. We need to order Osmocote. We need to order some other stuff from them. So we could talk about that in the future and tack your stuff on with ours and make it all pay that way.
Great. Does anybody else have questions from the pruning session?
Okay. So we'll jump right in here. We're going to talk about nursery maintenance throughout the year. And since we're in the middle of winter here, I thought we'd start there. So I just did this kind of following a 12-month calendar. And the months of November to March are kind of when you can take layoff and go easy for a while. The only thing I would recommend is going out to the nursery once in a while, checking for rodent damage, especially on your crab apples and cherries and other bark trees that the rodents like to feed on, because you might run into that. Come February or March, on a warm day above 40, that's when you want to start thinking about pruning all the trees that don't bleed. We talked about that when we were out at the nursery. Things like birches and sugar maples and yellowwoods don't want to be pruned this time of year. But pretty much everything else that you have out there can be pruned during February and March before they start to leaf out. And they'll actually heal up better at that time of year. There's less chance of disease getting in through the open wounds. So it's just a very good time to prune.
Dan, before you jump further forward, what do we do if we find rodent damage?
So if it's minor rodent damage, they just nibbled on one side of the tree, it will probably survive as long as we keep it healthy otherwise. If there's complete rodent damage where they gnaw the bark all the way around the trunk, you've pretty much lost that tree from your inventory. It might leaf out in the spring, and Richard may say, let's save that tree. But as soon as it calls for more nutrients and water, that tree is going to fail. It's actually going to digress and start to lose foliage and quickly fail on you. So again, if you have full girdling all the way around the trunk, then I would say just get rid of it now and not spend any more time or energy on that tree.
Do you spray your trees? Like at your nursery, do you spray to keep the rodents away?
Well, knock on wood, so far we haven't had any rodent damage. But I'm waiting for the day. I do try to walk out there now and again when I'm up there just to look for rodent damage. Voles would be the worst. Rabbits can be bad on some species. They do more nibbling on shrubs and that kind of thing, which we've got put away for the winter, less bark chewing, but voles can be a real problem. So just monitoring for them. I think we're fortunate in that our space is a little more open than yours is. We don't have the fence around it, so we're more likely to have some predators around, be they foxes or hawks or what have you, able to get in and feed on those voles if we do run into a problem. But with the fence around your nursery, the foxes can't get in for sure, and it makes it very difficult for a hawk to fly in and grab something.
And if you did find damage in the middle of the winter that was significant, would you go ahead and find a repellent type of spray to spray your trees with?
Well, repellents are difficult in that they're very short-lived. The weather breaks them down. You really need to go out there and reapply them. I think you would be better served either purchasing or finding some collars to put around the base of the tree white in color if possible to reflect the sun away from the bark, because often the trees that voles will feed on are also the ones that will frost crack on you. So it might just be good to get into the habit or start thinking about purchasing, or some people will use flexible PVC pipe that's white in color, and cut that to length and then slit it so you can fit it right around the tree. That would be an inexpensive way to go. They also have these ace bandage type wraps that you can put on. Those you would have to buy. But it might be good to get into the habit of just protecting them in the fall. But you want to make sure you take those wraps off in the spring because they will harbor disease underneath them and insects, and they can soften the bark up and make it more susceptible to frost cracking.
Does that go for the wraps and the other types of PVC? Yeah, okay, thank you.
They all should come off in the springtime. All right, so when we start to warm up a little in mid-March or April, that's probably when you want to uncover your trees. Take them out of their winter storage of bark chips and line them out. And then attach the drip irrigation right then. You don't have to turn on the drip irrigation then, but you want to have it all ready. As long as you're going through the motions of uncovering them and lining them out, you might as well just go ahead and throw your drip irrigation on at the same time. Come April, that would be the month to apply fertilizer. We talked about Osmocote to all your existing trees, and to begin looking for either winter annual weeds that may have come through the winter or new weeds that are starting to come up, and start to get those under control as soon as you see them growing. And also start to prepare for planting new liners. Make sure you have enough grow bags. Make sure you've got your compost and your bark lined up and all that kind of stuff, so that you're all ready when your liners do come in. Whether that's in April or May, that's up to you. And then come May, that's probably when you're going to want to turn your irrigation on and at least start running it once a week or a couple times a week. As the trees leaf out, that's when they start to require more water. So that's typically when you want to start to put your irrigation on. And continue that weed control. If you stay vigilant and stay after it, they won't get out of control to where you can't control them by hand weeding. So every time you go out to the nursery, pick a row or two and just go through and weed it. And that way you'll stay on top of it. And then you should probably plan on staking any of your newly planted trees right then when you pot them up. So that process is all done. When we were out there pruning some of the newly planted trees from the past year, you could see where they already needed to be staked. So doing that in the process of potting will just be one less thing to do in the future, and catch it before the tops of the trees start to curl or bend. We get into June. We continue with the irrigation, weed control, and you could also do some corrective pruning if necessary, especially on your new liners. If there's crossing branches, broken branches that happened in your potting process, you'll start to see them now as the trees leaf out. That's when or don't leaf out. That's when you can prune out dead branches and that kind of thing, or wounded branches. A lot of times when they're digging them up at the nursery and packaging them for shipping, branches rub and that kind of thing, and you won't find those until the trees try to leaf out. In June, again, irrigation, weed control. I'm going over June a second time. And pruning. July and August, you probably want to increase the irrigation run times, either by adding an extra day or increasing the time that it does run, and continue that weed control. That's going to be an ongoing process from when you uncover the trees until you put them to bed. Weed control is going to be a monthly check-in, so to speak. Come September, fall pruning on those bleeder trees that we talked about. Sugar maples, birches if you have any, yellowwoods if you have any. You can look that up online and find all the trees that bleed and make a list of those that you don't prune them in the spring, you prune them in the late summer or early fall. And in September, you can start to turn that irrigation down a little bit. As the trees start to go dormant, we actually want to cut back on the irrigation. We don't want to keep promoting growth at that time of the year. We want to get the trees to go to sleep the way they should. And if we keep irrigating them heavy, they're not going to go into dormancy the way we want come October. So come October, irrigation should be slowed or stopped altogether. That's when you probably want to shut it down. And be on the lookout for winter or fall germinating weeds. There are a lot of them. Shepherd's purse is a good example of one that germinates in the fall, and if you get it when it's small before it goes to seed, it'll be less of a problem in the springtime. So be on the lookout for those fall germinating weeds. And then come November, once the trees are fully dormant or you're confident they are going fully dormant, that's when you can bunch them together again and start to think about mulching them in for the winter. But you usually don't want to chip them in until the ground starts to freeze a little bit. Just the that crust that we get early winter, late fall, that's when you want to finally put the chips on. If you put the chips on too early, again, the trees aren't going to go fully dormant because they're not being exposed to the cold the way they would if they were exposed, and that can lead to winter injury problems by not allowing them to go fully dormant. And as you're putting them away, do that one last weed check as you're bunching them together. Pull any weeds you find. As I say, it's going to be a 12-month or 9-month process of weed control, doing it organically and by hand. And that takes us through the 12 months. If you got any questions.
You had talked about doing the fertilizing in, I wrote it down, March, April. Is there other times that you would do that over the course of the season? Or is it just a one-shot sort of deal?
Well, it all depends on what product you decide to use. We talked about Osmocote. Those come in 3 to 4 month or 8 to 9 month release formulations. So if you get one of those, you would only need to do it that one time in the spring. If you decide to go another route, you and I talked about compost, or let's say you're on a tight budget and you have to get a bag of tree tone from Espoma. That you might do spring and fall, just because it's a slower release product and it's a lower number of nutrients that you're putting on the plants. But if you do go the Osmocote route, the theory is you only have to do it once a year. And that's why it's going to save you from a maintenance standpoint. It's going to save you in the long run. You could get one bag of Osmocote that would probably last you for 2 years because you're not putting a lot on. You're putting like a third of a cup on each tree. So that Osmocote goes a long way. And last time I looked, I think it was around $50 or $60 a bag for a 50-pound bag. So I don't think it's going to break the tree committee budget to get a bag of Osmocote.
It might.
Or two.
No. Okay, so then my other question was about, and you were talking about staying on top of the weeds. So is there something, I mean, I know like when we put the trees in on the tree belt to do the mulch, but is there anything else that would be helpful in terms of just keeping the weeds down, like a physical barrier?
Well, again, you've tried some of the coconut fiber things on the top of them. Those are expensive, and it's hard to find the ones that are the proper size for your grow bags. You can certainly get clean, not sitting in a pile for too long. Either wood chips or bark mulch would be even better, and use that as a physical barrier. We talked about rice hulls. They use that a lot now. It's what remains after they process rice, and rather than throw it away, a lot of nurseries are using that for weed control now. It's very effective. It can be kind of messy, and it will blow around a little bit on windy days, and if the trees tip over, it all comes spilling out. but it is effective in keeping weeds down. And you could go lots of other mulch routes, coconut, cocoa mulch. I mean, you could get fancy if you wanted to. But I think just bark mulch would be a good way to create a physical barrier. You'll still get some weeds germinating in that, there's no doubt, but they're easy to pull out of the bark mulch, whereas the soil is a lot tougher.
If we go with the bark mulch method, my sense has been that most of the weeds that we're getting in these pots are perennial weeds. And so a couple questions. To me, it seems like this year we really need to concentrate on hand weeding to get the weeds out of there. But then if we were to put that mulch on, we'd have to put it on before we put the irrigation rings on there, I think, right? Yeah.
That is correct. And you would want to weed them clean before you put the mulch on as well. As far as the perennial weeds, if you look around the nursery there, that's where your perennial weed source is. Those weed seeds are blowing in, coming up around the containers. I was looking as we were leaving the last time. I think there's sumac and other stuff around the edges there on the town's property. There are all sorts of weed sources there that are, a challenge. And this is true of any nursery. You can't have a clear open space everywhere. So you're going to have sources of weed seeds, and like you said, it's just a matter of staying on top of them. Anybody else?
I feel like I have more questions, but as you went through the season, I forgot the earlier questions. So,
well, when they come up, you can ask me.
Do others have questions? Because that was kind of a lot to take in.
No? Well, if you remember them, Mary, anytime. So inventory management.
Actually, can we return to this? So you saw the size of our nursery. And typically in the past, you probably can tell from the condition of our nursery, we haven't had a steady schedule of maintenance there. So I mean, what do you think realistically is like the number of person hours a week we need there to kind of keep an eye on what's going on, keep the weeds at bay, do whatever other types of tasks we need there? Because I think this year we'll set up an actual sign-up system so that we just generate more, involvement. And I think the fact that we're all here, we've been here, lots of people have shown interest in your training and everything. I'm hoping that we have more participation because of this. But what do you think it would take for us to get there, where we have the nursery more well in hand?
Well, I would say somewhere between 5 and 10 hours a week. Especially during the busier times, the spring season, maybe a little less in the summer when weeds aren't germinating, and then it picks up again in the fall, as you start to see more weeds. But spring is when you're going to need to do the most, between planting and weeding and staking and pruning. There's quite a few hours there to be covered, we'll call it. But I wouldn't think any more than that. And if you could get a sign up where you had people, committed to going there and weeding 2 rows or 3 rows, that's going to make the whole thing a whole lot easier for everybody, rather than 1 or 2 people trying to take it all on and keep up with it.
You're saying 5 to 10
hours.
per person?
No.
Can you use the microphone?
So you're saying 5 to 10 one-person hours, like one person doing 5 to 10 hours?
Well, no, I'm saying, let's say you have a sign up where 2 people go on Tuesday and 2 other people go on Thursday. Between those 4 people, you're working about 5 to 10 hours. I think that would be plenty. It's not that big a nursery. I forget how many trees you have out there. Is it a couple hundred?
It'll be about 250 or so once we get this spring's order in.
Yeah. So again, that's not a huge amount of trees. If you think of some of these commercial nurseries with millions of trees, it's doable with 5 or 10 hours a week. All right.
I was curious also, we talked about, some of this is going to be hearkening back to what we talked about before. Richard and I have talked about putting a heavier duty, some sort of a landscape fabric down like we talked about, and then just keeping the fabric clean of chips and such. What would be a strategy for making that happen this year, given that we have trees in place already? Would you take advantage of all the trees being grouped together and try to get it laid out and then line the trees out?
100%. If you can do that before you line the trees out, that would be the best way to go. The first thing I would start by doing is scalping all the existing weeds down to nothing, raking up any kind of lumps or bumps of chips or other debris that you have there, get it as level as possible, and then just put the fabric down. You can buy that fabric anywhere from 3 foot to 18 feet or more in width. So you could almost do it with one sheet. I think our greenhouse down in Sunderland, I think we got a 15-foot width, and we had to use it, overlap it, to cover the full 30 feet of our greenhouse. But you can find it in various widths. You'll want the stakes to hold it down on the edges. But yeah, I think that's a great idea to cut down on your weed source and keeping it clean. I mean, that could be a work party's job, is to just keep the fabric clean, so that you don't have those sources of weeds. I mean, you're going to get some holes in the fabric, some weeds will germinate there, but that's a lot easier to control than what you're working with right now. And that would be another thing we can get for you from Griffin Greenhouse if you're ready for that this year.
We're definitely ready for it. Yeah.
All right, moving on to inventory management. So the big point I want to make is that the longer a tree stays in the nursery, the more money it's costing you. So if we can get them fertilized and pruned and looking good in, let's say, 3, possibly 5 years, it's going to be a lot less money on your end to produce these trees to plant out along the streets of Greenfield. And species selection is going to be very important in that as well. It takes a lot less time to grow a red maple to a plantable size than it does an oak. So I know you've got quite a few oaks out there. I'm not knocking you for that. I think oaks are great. We've got lots of them down in Sunderland, but it does take quite a bit more time to grow those up to a plantable size than it does a red maple or some of the other fast-growing species. In a wholesale setting, inventory is controlled by demand and sales. You don't have that option here, but if possible, it would be great to prepare a 2 to 5 year site planting plan. So this year, what street are we planting on? Woodley Ave. Next year, if you can plan out and say we're planting on, I don't know, Green Street, we'll say, and we know that's a site that is good for red maples or whatever, we can have those trees all earmarked for that spot. And then the next year we're planting on Oak Street, and we can have the trees planned out that we're going to plant there. And that will help you with your inventory control. And you can grow to where you're going to plant if you really get good at it. So if you know in 3 or 5 years you're going to be planting on a site that's really damp or what have you, you can grow for that site rather than just picking trees that at random, let's say.
Some of the ways we've been choosing trees is based on homeowner requests. So we know that lots of homeowners want the red maples, so we've been preparing for that, but we're also trying to encourage homeowners to take other types of trees like oaks and some of the other trees that have good ecological value as well. So
yeah, and you got to preach to them, the value of mixing up the species. Again, because of disease, because of insects, there seems to be something new every year that's attacking our trees. So planting a variety along the streets is really the best way to go. We all know that, but it's important to teach homeowners and residential people who are going to be receiving these trees, that the reason we're planting this oak is because you've got 2 maples on either side of it, and we want to vary it. That's an education piece that you need to work on in all that you do with Greenfield Tree Committee.
Dan, going back to what you said about the 3-year or so span of time that we want to keep trees in the nursery, in the case where it's difficult to purchase trees, I'm thinking specifically this year, we struck out on getting carpinus, particularly cultivars. Is it worthwhile in that case? I mean, they're already sort of slow growing, but they're hard to come by, and it seems like there's more interest in trees like that. Is it worth bringing them in and knowing that it's going to be a longer, time span to get them out and planted in that case?
Well, I guess you've got to, and I don't know how formally you've broken it down, what it cost you for a liner, a grow bag, maintenance, all that kind of thing. Nurseries that are growing commercially will break it down to the penny. You got to look at it and say, okay, a carpinus is going to take us 5 or 6 years to grow big enough to plant out for somebody. Does it make sense to contact Sugarloaf or somebody and say, hey, we're going to need 3 carpinus for next year. Can you bring those in at this size? And it might be more cost effective to do that than it is to grow them. The other thing I would say as far as getting them is in the future, if you can plan ahead this much, get your order in late summer or early fall. Nurseries are definitely, there's a lot fewer nurseries, and they're definitely selling out of lots of things early. And a species like carpinus that isn't grown widely to begin with is going to sell out quickly. So the earlier you can get your order in, my fruit tree order goes in July. And I start right after that with all my other orders. My Oregon orders have to be in by September 1st. You got to be planning ahead, I guess, is the best thing I can say for your future needs.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yep. So this kind of goes to our labeling talk, which is next, but one thing I would recommend is keeping detailed records of each variety planted, include the scientific and common name, size planted, planting date, and projected ready date if you can. That way, when it comes to inventory, you've got a handle on how many red maples you've got growing out at the nursery and when the first 5 are going to be ready to plant out. That'll help you with inventory control so you don't end up with 100 oaks and 150 of who knows how many other varieties. I'm just using oak because it's coming to my head quickly. I'm not picking on you for oaks. But that'll help you, and then having all that information, and we'll talk about this more with the tags. But if you have a spreadsheet with all the scientific name, common name, you can send that out to the whole committee, and everybody can have a handle on what's available. And that way, if they're talking to somebody on the street who and they find somebody who wants a tree, he or she knows what you have in the nursery and can say, hey, I'll talk to our committee and see if we can get you a red maple planted in that site. So again, that's going to be people working on a computer. I'm not saying it has to be you, Mary, but again, those will be hours that need to be accounted for in your work chart because somebody's going to need to spend some time putting that together.
I mean, I could possibly work on that. We could do like a Google sheet, and then people could even have that on their phones as well.
Yeah,
So
we do have a Google sheet already with all that in there. Yeah. It's relatively up to date.
Yeah.
Not entirely, but yeah. Excellent.
So another thing that the big growers do is they minimize shrinkage and loss. So maintaining a first in, first out program. So whatever you planted 3 years ago ought to be what's getting planted out this year. Don't bypass it just because it's not the variety that somebody wants. You got to sell that tree when it's ready. So find a spot for it, talk to whoever's getting the tree and say, hey, we've got a lot of these. Would you mind if we plant one in your site? It's a beautiful tree. You know, talk up the benefits of the tree, and I think you'll be able to sell it. It's what we do at the retail level all the time. If we know we've got a lot of something, let's say heritage birches, we're going to try and talk up heritage birches and get those out the door. And you need to take that same mentality when it comes to the nursery so that you can cut down on, you know, things outgrowing your grow bags, or the chance that disease or insects come in and damage things, or frost crack or canker. The list goes on of things that can happen while the trees are in the nursery. So you want to minimize that as much as possible.
Dan, we have some birches. I'm trying to think. I think we have a few black birches and maybe a couple of yellow, as well as some maybe black oak. We got in 2020 when we first started the nursery, and those things are still in the nursery. They seem to be about the same size as when we potted them up. I mean, some of that could be improper pruning or not enough fertilization, but last year we did plant some of the oaks just out in Shattuck Park in sort of a naturalized area just to get them in the ground and get them out of the nursery. At this point, would you think that that's the best strategy, is to just move those out of the nursery because for whatever reason they're not thriving in their existing environment?
I would say that would be the best course of action. It's surprising that birches aren't growing fast, because in my experience, in the little bit of growing that I did and working at Stewart's, birches jump out of the ground generally around here. I would, you know, go back to fertilizer, and maybe that's one of the causes. I'd have to look at them closer and see if there's anything else going on there. But I think getting them in the ground is important. They're going to become root bound even in the grow bags, and be very difficult to get out of those grow bags, because that root system, I'm sure, is still growing underground, and for whatever reason the tops aren't keeping up. So I would definitely find sites for those to be planted out.
On that question that Mary asked, are there any trees that are known to have issues with the different, you know, the changing of the temperatures, the climate? Is there anything like, I think birches are probably used to a lot colder weather. I'm not sure. It's just a question about climate and different. Is that possibly the reason why they're not growing?
I doubt it with birches. I mean, sugar maple is the big one that we all hear about that's going to suffer with climate change. They really need a cold winter to go through, and it's already being seen in the sugaring industry with sugar bushes dying off or thinning out, and the whole industry moving northward, more into Canada, less here, and definitely less south of us. And even in Vermont and New Hampshire, they're starting to struggle a little bit. But you know, going back to the birches, I think that's something else going on. I haven't heard that birches are struggling due to climate change at all. I think what we're seeing more than anything, rather than a retreat northward like the sugar maples are doing, I think we're seeing a movement from south to north of species that we couldn't grow maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that are now, you know, okay planting up here. Be it sweet gums, which can be a problem in the wintertime, or red buds, which can be a problem in the fall and winter. Those are all trees that are starting to actually thrive here because our winters are warmer, not including this one.
I'm curious about birches. So earlier on, we were excited about planting yellow and gray birch in front yards, you know, not in tree belts necessarily. We haven't worked with river birch at all because we're mostly dealing with tree belts. But I'm just curious if you think, I mean, given the known ecological benefits of birches, what you would recommend that we pursue planting in the future?
I really think river birch is the way to go. It's widely grown. It grows well around here. It has the same ecological benefits of your yellow birch and gray birch. And I think it would be cheaper for you to purchase because it is grown more widely. and you can certainly find them in single stem form as well as clump form. I think you're more interested in the single stem. The one problem, the biggest problem I have with birches, and river birches seem to be one of the worst, is they're always dropping something. They're dropping catkins, they're dropping sap, they're dropping small branches. So you've got to really choose wisely as to where you plant them because of those things. You don't want to plant them over a driveway. You probably don't want to plant them over a sidewalk. And they'll also bend over, especially when they're young in these ice storms like we just got, or heavy wet snow, which we seem to get more of now than the nice powdery stuff that we used to get when I was growing up. So that's something to take into account with any birch, not just river birch. They all do the same thing. They're a little bit weaker wooded than some of the other trees you have out at the nursery, so it's something you have to really plan your planting sites carefully before you plant up a lot of them.
Great, thanks.
Yep. Just going back to minimizing shrinkage and loss, maintaining healthy plants out at the nursery through pest control and fertilization and proper maintenance will cut down on the number of dead ones or ones you have in the hospital area, so to speak. Just keeping everything as healthy as possible going forward will make it more trees that you can plant out and less that have to be pampered and babied over in the hospital area. And that way you're not spending as much time on plants that maybe will never make it out to the planting sites. And removing those varieties that are always problematic. When we were out at the nursery a week ago, we all looked at the red buds that you have planted out there, and there's a lot of deadwood on those. There's canker on them, and maybe that's a variety that you don't plant any more of, or you only plant 5 of them instead of 15 of them, something like that. I know they're popular with homeowners, but they can be hard to grow. So again, like the Carpinus we talked about earlier, maybe that's one you contact us or somebody and just say, hey, we're going to need 3 of these to plant out next year. Could you find them as small as possible in 7-gallon containers? And we'll do the best we can to find those for you so that the cost is lower and you don't have the problem of buying 10 or 15 of them and having 7 of them die on you. And then make sure to have enough inventory on hand to cover the current year's planting projections. So if you're going to plant 7 trees on Woodley Avenue this year, you need to replace those 7 trees for the coming years, along with some extra for other places that may come up along the way. So just planning ahead to cover those trees that are going to get planted out. Like those, however many you think you're going to plant on Woodley, I think you have a meeting coming up on that so you can figure out planting sites. Just take those out of inventory or highlight them in red and say those are no longer available so that you know those are spoken for. And then you know you need to replace that many trees going forward.
In the past, when we've had a planting like that, it'll probably be 20 or 24 trees that we're tagging for the community planting. I've just been using colored ribbons, obvious big colored ribbons so they don't get snatched by somebody else who wants them for another site. Is that the best way to go in our size nursery?
Yeah, that's the least expensive way to go. I mean, you could go fancy and buy sold tags or whatever, but you don't need to do that in your setting. But I'm saying on your Google spreadsheet, maybe you come up with a way to notate that those trees are spoken for, those 20 or 25 trees are spoken for, so that everybody on the committee knows those are no longer available and they don't find somebody who wants one of them. Just so you keep that up to date as close as possible to keep the inventory flowing, so to speak. Any other questions?
Are we getting into locations of, so one of the things that I've struggled with, it's easy enough to maintain the Google Sheet with all the pertinent information on it, but then where is it in the nursery and how to, you can flag it in the nursery, but then correlating to that, correlating that to what's in the spreadsheet. I mean, is there a preferred way of kind of keeping track of things in the nursery?
I think a simple way for you to do it, inexpensive, would be to just label all the rows, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, however you want to do it. On your stakes that you have out there already, putting a number or a letter on each one of those, and then correlating it to the spreadsheet, so you know that your red sunset maples are in row 1, and maybe you could have it split up into 2 blocks. Since you kind of have a walkway in the middle there, you could have your front block be A1 and the back block could be B1, 2, 3.
Yeah, we have it in quadrants since there's 4 sections, so that's kind of how we've been doing it.
Yeah, so just, again, numbering or whatever, your quadrants, and then numbering or lettering the rows in the quadrants so that you can put that into your Google spreadsheet and therefore make it easier to find the trees you're looking for. I think will be very handy.
And we do have that mapping program coming up. I wonder if you could integrate that with the Google sheet. We have a mapping.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
I wondered about that as well. It may be overkill for such a small nursery, but it might be fun to try to see if it makes sense.
Yeah, it could be good practice to use it on the nursery itself. But again, I think a simple number or letter system within your quadrants is going to be the easiest way to go. Anybody else?
What about, I guess maybe it matters less, but I've struggled with trying to keep, species together in the nursery, because that's just kind of how my brain works. Visually I like to know either all the shade trees are in one area, or, all the maples and oaks or whatever are grouped together. Is that something, we can start out that way when we first line everything out in the springtime, and then it seems like chaos hits at some point. Because we're wanting to, as we move trees out of the nursery, we're wanting to consolidate trees so we're not running lines of irrigation with just 1 or 2 trees hooked up to them. So what's the process for preventing chaos to take over?
So when we were out there late fall, before the snow came, we talked about that east end being a little more damp, that occasionally the water runs through there a little higher. So that would be the first place I would start, is looking at the site and saying, okay, we know we've got a little extra water here. Maybe we should put the red maples and the river birch in that spot. So I would start with that. But I think grouping things by genus and species, keeping all your maples together, all your oaks together, would be the best way to go. When it comes to plants that are going to go out the door this spring, when you're going through the motions of spreading them out from the chips later on, get those trees are going out the door close to the gate right off the bat, rather than moving them twice. I think it's a great idea to clump things together as much as possible so you're not running empty lines of irrigation. We have that problem down in Sunderland, but we're a little different site than you are. But I think, again, having your older plants at one end or the other would be a good way to go. Maybe it makes sense to have the older ones closer to the gate, again, because those are going to go out the door sooner than the plants that you're going to put in this year. It's kind of something you have to come to an agreement as a group. This is the best way to do it. But I do think taking into account the moisture issues at that east end would be a good idea, and then bunching things together by genus and species. Anybody else? All right, we're going to move right along here. If I can find my other pad. So when it comes to tree labeling, there are a lot of companies out there selling fancy tag machines and that kind of thing. I looked around at some of them, and there's a company called Aura Visual. They're out of Texas. They used to be called Horticultural Printers. They sell about 8 different printers that are available. They're going to run you anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000, and you would hook them up to your computer and run them that way. You only have 250 trees. I don't think one of those printers is really in the cards for you just yet.
But what if DCR is paying for it?
Well, if DCR is paying for it, then that's a different story. But I do think finding the simplest one that'll work for you is probably the best way to go. And if they're paying for it, that's great. But that's the company I would look into first. I always Google them by horticultural printers. They've changed names like 3 times in the last 10 or 15 years. So, but horticultural printers will get you there. So whatever you decide to purchase, it should be able to print all the pertinent information on the tag for you. So that means genus and species, common name, if there's room there to put the date it was planted, where it came from would be great too. That way if you have a problem, let's say you buy 10 red sunset maples and you lose all 10 of them, you can go back to the nursery and say, hey, we had a problem with these. Can you give us some credit? That kind of thing. So having that information on there, all of that should be in the printer's ability to do. So simple is great, but you want one that can get you all the information. And then you've got the cost of tags as well. We use strip tags. They call them strip tags because you can tear them apart. And then they have little holes in them that you can wrap around a branch or around the trunk. And they stay pretty well. The one thing I'll say about a printed tag versus a handwritten tag is that the printed tag generally holds up better, whereas a handwritten tag will fade rather quickly. Even if you use one of President Trump's Sharpies, it will fade quickly. But printed tags last for several years, which is all you need. But you can get 2,000 strip tags for about $200. So the tags are the least costly of all of these. But you do need to figure out, the machine you're going to get to print the tags and then what tags you need with them. But horticultural printers can help you with all that if that's who you use. And again, just having all that information on there, genus, species, common name, date planted, scheduled plant out date would be another thing to have on there. Possibly include height and width of the tree and the zone hardiness. If there's room on the tag and the machine has the ability to print it for you, why not put all that information on there? And you can leave the tag right on there when you plant it out for the homeowner. That way they know what they got and they can refer back to it. As long as they know that tag needs to come off at some point within the tree's life, so it doesn't grow into the tree. That would all be great information to have on the tag when you go to purchase your machine. As far as the labels themselves, I mean, if you do get some fading going on, you could just reprint tickets if you're going the machine route. If you go the handwritten route, you can just have somebody's job be to kind of check tags every now and again and make sure they're not fading and rewrite them if need be. But if you're going to purchase a machine, you can just go back to your computer and print out new tags. And you could use 2 colors for the tags because you can buy these strip tags in different colors. One could be an informational tag, while another color is placed on the tree to signify ready for planting or possible planting site. So you could have 2 different colors on there, again going back to your flagging ribbon thing. If you know you're going to plant that tree out, you could print a tag that says this is going to Woodley Avenue in March and have a separate tag on there with something printed on it that tells everybody where that tree is going. If you got the ability to do that, you might as well use that machine to its utmost and save you time and effort with the flagging ribbon. That's really all I have on tags.
One thing we wondered about off and on was tracking the tree's success from growing it in the nursery to growing out at a site. And we thought that would require like a discrete number, like a 103, maple 103. We know we planted in 2022, and then it got planted out on Woodley Avenue, and in 5 years when we do an inventory, we're able to understand like, oh, all these red maples that we got from such and such a place, they're doing great, or they're not doing so well, or whatever. Do you think that is overkill, or do you think that if we have the volunteer time and interest in doing something like that, do you think there's value in trying to do something like that?
Well, all of these systems have the ability to print SKUs and barcodes and all that kind of thing nowadays. So you could manipulate the SKU and have some kind of a code on there that says, RSM for Red Sunset Maple, and you could have the initials of the nursery in there, let's say BAL for Bailey's, and then you could put the date on there. You could put all kinds of information within the SKU that is something and can take back to the spreadsheet or go back to the spreadsheet with, but the person who gets the tree will have no idea what that number or code is, and that will allow you to track it. And, again, I don't know that I would leave a tag on a tree for 3 years because the tree, depending on the species, could grow around it in that time. That may be something you want to look into, some kind of different labeling system. I know when we did the tree tour earlier in the year, you had the little labels high up on the trees. That may be something that you put on a label like that going forward. But in the 2 to 3 year time frame, a strip tag like we're talking about would be fine on a smaller branch. I wouldn't put it around the trunk. Any other questions about tagging, labeling? It's a quiet group tonight. Everybody's tired from shoveling snow. Yes. Well, that's really all I had, unless you have other questions about different topics altogether.
I had a question about black birch, which I've read somewhere that it's a reasonable street tree. Do you have any experience with black birch? Because they look tidier.
Well, I'll tell you, it's very hard to come by from any commercial grower. It's not widely grown. Even yellow birch is a tough one to find. So some of those native varieties that grow around here, the commercial growers just aren't growing them. I would say black birch is a tidier tree. I see it growing out in the woodlots around here all the time. And it is a nice clean tree. The bark is nice on it. It still has the catkins, still produces the sap. I don't think it's as weak wooded as some of the other birches, so that would be a benefit. And maybe fewer branches dropping, but it's the supply issue that would be your biggest challenge. You might have to go to like a native nursery somewhere. And maybe even New England wetland plants, and see if they have some small ones that you could buy from them and plant out in your grow bags and grow up to a more desirable size.
Is that Lenta, or is that some other?
That's Betula lenta. It's what they make birch beer out of. They actually make maple syrup from it in some places as well, or birch syrup.
That's the stuff when you go into the woods and you get take a twig or something like that. It smells like root beer. Yeah.
What else in terms of hearkening back to everything we've heard over the last few weeks. Does anybody have other questions? We have Dan at our exposure, or at our, what's the
Disposal.
There we go. For a while longer, and actually I'll send a note out to all of our members to let them know one more time that you're coming to our next meeting, our full meeting, and we'll have a chance to talk with you a little bit more then.
Yeah, and certainly put together questions. You know, I love answering questions, so write them down and come with a boatload of them. We'll answer as many as we can.
Sounds good.
I have a species question. Do you guys consider, or do people grow, and I've seen and I know they're slow growing, are sassafras? Is that?
Were you on the tree tour this summer? Okay. There were some sassafras down in the park. I forget the name of it.
Energy Park.
Yeah, Energy Park. And we talked about those. It is another tree like black birch that most commercial growers shy away from. It's hard to come by. I know I got in 2 last year, I think, maybe 3, and Smith College took them all. So it's a hard one to find. It's a beautiful tree. It's a great native. Grows fine around here. It will sucker up and kind of create a grove around itself eventually, which can be good or bad depending on the site it's planted in. But it's certainly a great tree, and it would be one, if you could find the liners for it, that I would think about growing. Because it can be a fairly good street tree and not too large. It would almost go underneath the power lines and that kind of thing, which is always a consideration when you're planting street trees.
I find it really interesting that the sassafras that I've seen, either just out in the wild or like the ones that were planted at Energy Park, have all formed thickets. And I planted I've got 4 sassafras along the north border of my property, and none of them have ever suckered. And they've gotten to be, they're like 40 feet tall. Very strange.
That would be something to research and see if there's male and female trees, and one suckers and one doesn't. I've never done that research on sassafras, but it would be interesting to look into that and Google suckering on sassafras and see if there's anything out there as to why yours are not. Because I've always been under the assumption that they all suckered from their roots. And
actually this year was the first time we've ever seen a seedling from one of the sassafras. As we were going along weeding, we recognized a sassafras seedling. So
time to plant it out in the nursery.
Yeah, it was about this big. We'll see if I can find it again this year.
I wonder whether you could, just in the interest of being cost effective, take any root suckers from the trees at Energy Park and plant them out in the nursery and see what happens.
They're trying to, every year, the folks who maintain Energy Park, which is another volunteer group, they're trying to get those suckers out of there. So they are a little hard to transplant, to get enough of, to dig enough of it to transplant it. But
it might be worth an experiment, trying 2 or 3 and seeing what you get out of them.
Yeah.
Just because they're there and they want to get rid of them anyway.
What about sourwood? I didn't see that. I was hoping maybe to try to find that tree this year, but I didn't see it available out there.
I can't find any either, so if you find some, let me know. Another beautiful tree, not a native, but a beautiful. Well, it is a native. Sorry, I take that back. It is a native. Beautiful fall color, beautiful bark. There's a great specimen down in the center of Sunderland, just past the huge sycamore on the same side as the sycamore. But in the past, it has been borderline hardy for us. When I was at Hadley Garden Center, we'd always recommend planting it in a protected location. There's one in the center of Amherst, right by Amherst Cinema near the bank, that was in kind of a microclimate, and it grew beautifully there. And 20, 25 years ago, you had to plant them in those protected sites. Now that our climate is warming, that's one of those species that maybe we can start to plant out a little bit more, not have it in a protected location, and be successful with it. but it's finding them. No liner growers that I know of are growing it. And even, for me to find retail-ready trees is very difficult. I think it's one of these trees that's very slow to grow, very slow to propagate, and therefore nurseries shy away from it. Going back to inventory, they don't want to keep a sourwood in their inventory for 10 years so they can sell it and maybe get $100 more than they do a red maple that they can turn over every 5 years.
Right. I think some landscaper or nursery had some in the area at one point, maybe 20 years ago, because there's probably about 10 mature sourwoods around Greenfield that I know of, and I always forget about them until the fall when they have the showy panicles from the the spent blooms that are on and then also the foliage color is really beautiful.
I would blame that on Stewart's Nursery.
I wondered about that. Yeah,
that was one of Jim Stewart's favorite trees.
Interesting.
And if you ever go to the garden center there's a beautiful one behind the garden center that was a leftover, and it never got moved, and it rooted in, and it just stayed there.
Oh, that's neat.
Anybody else? Anything tree related? Well, thank you for having me, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thanks, Dan. This has been really great. Really appreciate it.